Most travelers see Mexico through a narrow lens. Resort pools in Cancun, all-inclusive buffets, and carefully curated beach experiences. But 20 miles inland from those tourist corridors lies a completely different country. A Mexico where pre-Hispanic traditions merge with contemporary innovation, where family-owned workshops produce world-class craftsmanship, and where the food, architecture, and daily rhythms operate on an entirely different frequency than anything you've encountered. I've spent the last 6 months exploring the parts of Mexico that don't make it into travel brochures. What I've found challenges every assumption about luxury travel in Latin America. This isn't a tour of hidden beaches or secret cenotes. This is about understanding a culture that's been largely invisible to the outside world. Let's start with Oaxaca, but not the Oaxaca you've seen on Instagram. We're heading to the Sierra Mixe, a mountain region where indigenous communities have maintained autonomy for centuries. The drive from Oaxaca City takes 4 hours on winding dirt roads. There are no luxury hotels here, no tour operators, no safety nets for travelers who expect everything to be translated and simplified. What exists instead is a functioning society that predates European contact. We're talking about communities with their own languages, legal systems, and governance structures. In the village of Totantepec, I sat with a local council as they deliberated on land use and mix, with no Spanish spoken for 3 hours. This isn't a cultural performance for visitors. This is daily life. The architecture here tells a story that contradicts the narrative of indigenous poverty. These aren't primitive structures, they're sophisticated adaptations to mountain climates, using techniques that regulate temperature naturally and withstand earthquakes that would demolish modern buildings. The complexity of the construction rivals anything you'd find in contemporary sustainable architecture. And the textiles. In Teotitlán del Valle, weavers work with natural dyes extracted from insects, plants, and minerals. The cochineal beetle produces a red so vivid it was once worth more than gold. These aren't cheap souvenirs. A single tapestry can take 3 months to complete and sell for thousands of dollars to collectors who understand what they're looking at. The geometric patterns aren't decorative. They're encoded information systems, preserving historical records and cosmological knowledge. And now San Miguel de Allende. Everyone knows it as a pretty colonial town full of American expats. But if you get past the main plaza or right past the galleries and rooftop bars, there's an entirely different city. The neighborhood of San Antonio is where the workers who built those colonial mansions actually lived. The streets are narrower, the buildings more utilitarian, but the history is richer. This is where you find workshops that have been operating for generations. Blacksmiths, stone carvers, furniture makers using 16th century techniques. I visited a family-run carpentry shop where they still use traditional joinery methods, no nails or screws, just precise cuts and natural adhesives. The patriarch learned from his grandfather, who learned from his grandfather. They're not trying to preserve the past for tourists. They're simply continuing to work the way that makes sense to them. When I asked why they didn't modernize, the answer was simple. Why would we? This works. The irony is that while wealthy foreigners buy restored colonial homes for millions, the craftspeople who maintain the skills to actually restore those properties properly can't afford to live in the center anymore. There's a tension here that nobody wants to talk about. The preservation of beautiful architecture comes at the cost of displacing the culture that created it, moving to Guanajuato, specifically the mines. Everyone visits the colorful houses and the underground streets, but few people understand that this city was built on silver extraction that funded the Spanish Empire for centuries. The Valenciana mine alone produced a third of the world's silver in the 18th century. You can still tour these mines, but not as a sanitized historical site. Active mining continues in some sections. You descend 300 meters below the surface, the temperature drops, and you understand immediately why so many people died here. The indigenous and enslaved African workers who extracted this wealth are barely mentioned in the tourist narrative. But their presence is everywhere if you know where to look. In the survival strategies still used by local communities, in the social structures, in the wealth disparities that persist today. Let's talk about food, but let's be honest about it. Mexican cuisine is having a moment internationally, but what's being celebrated is often a simplified version of something far more complex. Take mole. Everyone knows it's a sauce with chocolate. What they don't know is that there are hundreds of regional variations, some containing 30 or more ingredients that must be toasted, ground, and combined in a specific sequence that can take 3 days. The recipe isn't written down. It's transmitted through practice, through muscle memory, through sensory knowledge that can't be fully captured in language. In the Mixteca region, I watched a woman prepare mole amarillo. She didn't measure anything. She didn't use a timer. She knew when each ingredient was ready by smell, by color, by sound. This is expertise at a level that would be revered in any other culinary tradition. But because it's Mexican, because it's indigenous, it gets reduced to authentic street food. The market in Tehuantepec operates on a scale that's hard to comprehend until you're inside it. We're talking about hundreds of vendors, most of them women, selling ingredients you won't find in any cookbook grasshoppers, prepared 7 different ways. Chocolate ground, fresh with almonds, cinnamon, and sugar. 20 varieties of chilies, each with distinct heat profiles and uses herbs that don't have English names. This is also where you see the real economy of Mexico. The market women, Las Tejuanas, are famous for their economic power and social status. In this region, indigenous women have controlled commerce for centuries. They own property, run businesses, and wield significant political influence. This contradicts every stereotype about machismo and female oppression in Mexican culture. One vendor told me she makes more than her husband, a teacher, and has put 3 children through university with her market earnings. The elaborate traditional dresses they wear, which tourists photograph constantly, cost thousands of dollars. This is wealth and status being displayed openly, but because it doesn't look like Western wealth, it gets interpreted as folklore. The distillation villages of Oaxaca produce mezcal that rivals any whiskey or cognac in complexity. I'm not talking about the bottles you find in liquor stores, I mean the mezcal maestros who work with wild agave varieties. Tobala, Tepestate, Jabali, that take 15 to 35 years to mature. The production is minuscule. A single palenque might produce 200 bottles a year. The maestro mezcalero I met has been refining his process for 40 years. He can identify the terroir of an agave by taste, can tell you what elevation it grew at, what the rainfall was like that year. This is sophistication equivalent to any wine sommelier, but the recognition and compensation don't match. A bottle of rare mezcal that took decades to produce sells for a fraction of what a similar aged scotch commands. Luis Barragan is Mexico's most famous architect internationally, but his work is deeply rooted in Mexican spatial concepts that predate modernism. The way he uses color, light, and water doesn't come from European influences. It comes from Mexican vernacular architecture, from hacienda design, from the courtyards and gardens that have existed here for centuries. His house in Mexico City is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but it's not a museum. It's a functioning argument about how to live. The rooms are small by luxury standards. There's no air conditioning. The genius is in how air flows, how light changes throughout the day, how the minimal spaces feel expansive because of proportion and color. I spent an afternoon in that house, and what became clear is that Barragan was trying to create something specifically Mexican, not international. He was rejecting the idea that modernism had to look the same everywhere. The bright pink and yellow walls that seem so bold were common in Mexican villages long before Barragan used them. He was elevating vernacular traditions, not inventing something new. In contemporary architecture, there's a generation of Mexican architects reclaiming that approach. Tatiana Bilbao, Frida Escobedo, Mauricio Rocha, they're designing buildings that respond to Mexican climate, Mexican materials, Mexican social patterns. These aren't nostalgia projects, they're sophisticated contemporary buildings that reject the idea that good design has to look like it could be in Tokyo or New York. The problem is funding. Most architectural budgets in Mexico go to developments that could be anywhere. Glass towers, shopping malls, corporate headquarters that follow international standards. The experimental, culturally specific work happens on smaller projects with lower budgets. There's a disconnect between what's valued internationally and what gets built in Mexico. Here's what makes this complicated. The Mexico I've been describing coexists with violence, corruption, and poverty that can't be ignored. You can't have an honest conversation about Mexican culture without acknowledging that many of the regions I've visited have serious security concerns. The communities preserving traditional knowledge are often the same communities facing displacement, drug trafficking, and lack of basic services. The luxury travel narrative wants to separate these realities, to say you can experience authentic culture without confronting difficult truths. But they're inseparable. The reason certain regions have preserved their traditions is often because they've been economically marginalized. The isolation that protected cultural practices also means inadequate healthcare, education, and infrastructure. I've had conversations with craftspeople who want their children to leave, to get professional jobs in cities, to not continue the family trade because, as beautiful as that work is, it doesn't pay enough. The tourists and collectors who buy their work aren't providing sustainable incomes. We celebrate cultural preservation while the people actually doing that preservation struggle financially. Tourism itself is a double-edged dynamic. The attention can bring resources and opportunities, but it also distorts local economies and creates dependencies. Towns that once fed themselves now import food to serve what tourists expect. Traditional buildings get converted to boutique hotels, pricing out local residents. The culture becomes performance, something produced for external consumption rather than lived practice. At the same time, I've met people who are navigating this thoughtfully. Indigenous communities create tourism cooperatives that they control, setting their own terms for engagement. Chefs opening restaurants that pay fair wages and source exclusively from local producers. Architects designing affordable housing that incorporates traditional techniques. What I'm suggesting is that understanding Mexico requires sitting with contradiction. This isn't a country that can be summarized easily or packaged for consumption. The luxury isn't in five-star accommodations or exclusive experiences. It's in the depth of knowledge that exists here, the sophistication of practices that have evolved over centuries, the complexity of a culture that refuses simple categorization. The question for travelers isn't just where to go, but how to engage with a place in a way that's honest about power dynamics, that recognizes expertise wherever it exists, and that doesn't reduce everything to aesthetic consumption. Mexico has been teaching me that lesson for 6 months, and I suspect I've only started to understand. If this perspective on travel interests you, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment about places you visited that challenged your assumptions. And share this video with someone who thinks they understand Mexico. They might be surprised.